Welcome to another Top Grades Made Easy video. I'm with First Rate Tutors. We're looking at the Christmas Carol past questions, and from that we're going to give you a prediction. So, do you want to start us off with 2017?
Yes, so when it comes to Christmas Carol, one way to think about what question might come up in the future, and of course we did this with our previous prediction video last year, is look at the previous questions and the patterns that came up. So of course, when it comes to the 2017 paper, students were presented with an extract from Stave 3, okay? More specifically, the Cratchit family having the Christmas dinner. And the question was to do with how Dickens shows the struggles of the poor. I think the idea of the struggles of the poor is such a powerful question, and it's also quite a really easy and straightforward question. Because when it comes to talking about the struggles of the poor, firstly you're thinking about Dickens's overall message, right? Remember that Dickens intended this novella for his richer, wealthier readers to understand the struggles of the poorer workers. A lot of them actually generally were just not aware of these challenges, hence why we can see that Scrooge is even shocked when he witnesses Bob Cratchit's family having this very meager meal, and of course they also seem very happy, okay? So also that's another side of the struggles of the poor, right? So Dickens also wants to almost present them as somewhat more pious and more grateful for the little that they have, in contrast to wealthy industrialists and wealthy capitalists like Scrooge, who doesn't actually, he seems very ungrateful, and he wants to miserly hold on to his wealth and not share it, okay? So I think this is any question to do with poor, poverty and so on is a great question. You can also tie it to lots of different themes. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, I love the way you started off by saying, you know, that's Dickens' main reason for writing the novel. And there isn't that much to this novel for that reason. It's really obvious to see what Dickens is up to. And what's great about that for you in an exam is whatever the question actually is, it's really always about poverty, because it's the attitude to the poor that Dickens wants to change. So it's going to be a really easy essay to adapt to any question.
Okay.
So then we have 2018, and we've got the Phantom, the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. And the question was how Dickens presents Scrooge's fears. Because one way of looking at the fears is it's his fear of death that makes him change. I actually don't argue that at all. But concentrating on Scrooge's fears is now a character question. And the danger of the character question is it doesn't necessarily lead you back to writing about Dickens' ideas. We talked about it being ideas about poverty. If you were doing this question about the fear, would you link it to Dickens' views about poverty or not?
I definitely think in terms of Dickens's ideas about poverty, in most Christmas Carol questions, I always advise my students to do so.
Yes.
To link to Dickens's message of poverty. Now, when thinking about this question, how Scrooge's fears are presented, the link I would make to poverty is that Scrooge is presented as a symbol and as a representative of wealthy businessmen, wealthy industrialists who increased the poverty gap, okay? And what I would tie this into is Scrooge's fears that he is beyond redemption for his impact on people, poorer people like Bob Cratchit. So yes, to answer your question, I would definitely tie it to poverty, but more so the other side of the coin, thinking about how Scrooge realizes or believes that he's now beyond redemption for his treatment of the poor.
Brilliant.
Okay.
I totally agree. It's
so,
you now, isn't it?
Yes.
2019.
So for the 2019 exam, students were presented with Stave 1, specifically Marley's ghost. He's covered in chains and he's there to warn Scrooge about shifting his own attitudes and behaviour, okay? And the question was to do with how Dickens uses the ghost, this is Marley's ghost, or even more broadly the ghosts, to help Scrooge change. Now, this question, again, is a great question. Obviously, you can tie it to poverty, but you can tie it to lots of different themes. And the main thing that you're thinking about is firstly how the supernatural is used. So, of course, you have Marley's ghost, who basically presents Scrooge with this idea that he's going to be beyond redemption. And, of course, remember that Dickens is presenting this novella to a deeply religious readership, okay? So the Victorians at the time who were reading this deeply believed in the afterlife, and so they were afraid that if they carried on mistreating the workers, then they would face the same fate. But of course, with this question, in terms of how ghosts are used to help Scrooge change, you can talk about literally any of the other ghosts. You've got the ghost of Christmas present, the ghost of Christmas past, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. All of these ghosts individually teach him the value of family, the value of Christmas, but equally, of course, the importance of treating the poorer people in society more charitably.
Brilliant.
Okay.
And I love the link, to the Christian message, your soul is in danger if you don't change.
Yes.
Right, so we now come to 2020. This is actually my favourite extract. Ignorance and Want in Stave 3. It's right at the end of Stave 3. And the question was, how Dickens presents the suffering of the poor. My favourite question. And if you think about the novel, if you took out this moment with ignorance and want, got rid of it, let's say an editor said, no, you can't have that in, the whole story would still be exactly the same. Like Scrooge's journey would be the same. And that gives us a massive clue that Dickens has only put that in because it carries his political message. It's not part of the plot. So it's a super easy one to link to his main idea, the suffering of the poor. I therefore teach my students, whatever the question is, write about that. If you always write about ignorance and want, it's easy to make relevant to any question. And because ignorance and want are about Dickens' ideas, you're automatically getting the top grades again. Yeah,
I agree. And I think the ignorance and want section should definitely be just one of your memorized quotations, because as Mr Salles mentions, you can literally use it for any questions that come up and indeed any extract that comes up, okay? Now, for the 2021 exam, students were presented with Stave 2, where you've got Fezziwig's party, right? And Fezziwig is a really interesting character because he's a wealthy businessman, but obviously he uses his wealth to help his workers, to empower them. And the question was to do with how ideas about joy and happiness are presented. Now, when I saw this question, in all honesty, I kind of feel like it's a bit of an awkward question, because joy and happiness is not strictly a theme, okay? It's kind of one of those ideas to do with, just how, if you're more charitable, are you happier, right? And so I think sometimes if you get awkward questions like this, you shouldn't kind of panic and think, oh my gosh, there's no theme about joy and happiness, what can I talk about? You then think, actually, the great thing about having this awkward question means I can literally talk about any themes, and of course using the extract, but also any part of the novella. I think this question is interesting because you can tie it to the theme of greed. We can see that Fezziwig, who's presented as almost illuminated during this party, he is illuminated and he seems happier, he seems more joyful because he gives to his poorer workers. But of course, also when you're thinking about other themes, right? So for example, the theme of Christmas, the theme of family, Dickens is trying to make the message that generosity and also valuing things like Christmas, family is what's going to lead to joy and happiness. So that generosity and also valuing things like Christmas, family is what's going to lead to joy and happiness. So going back to what I was saying in terms of these kind of awkward questions, what you want to actually see when you're thinking about these types of questions in exams is, if you get an awkward question, actually that gives you the liberty and the freedom to include other interesting themes and also to broadly consider the messages of the novella.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd obviously want to link it to the idea of poverty. So people like Scrooge, the reader, the rich reader, is going to uncover joy and happiness in their lives by helping the poor. That's what's going to give them their happiness, just as Scrooge gets that happiness. I've even seen a 100% essay, a 30 out of 30 essay, where the student decided to write about music. So they'd studied the musicality of the novel. I haven't, but they were able to relate that entirely to that question, which backs up your idea. Make it fit what you want to write about.
Okay, so the next question, 2022, what came up in that exam?
So, 2022, we had this image of Scrooge abandoned in school, so we're all supposed to feel really sorry from the beginning, and it was about the effects of loneliness. This again is, in a way, a theme question, but it's not really one that we think about, is it, when we're studying the novel? And so it's another one that invites you to think, well, what do I want to write about? The easy one here is, because it's right at the beginning, is Scrooge's journey and how he learns to, guess what, help the poor, because I'm going with the theme of poverty.
So I think in terms of the effects of loneliness, as he's mentioned, I think there's lots you can talk about, and I think again, as you've mentioned, it's a very flexible question in terms of linking it to other themes. Now, in last year's exam, the 2023 exam, students were presented with Stave 2 again, and what I found really interesting when we were going over these past questions was how many times Stave 2 has come up in the last 3 years. So this was yet another Stave 2 question, but instead in this extract you had Belle and Scrooge breaking up. Okay, so Belle was talking about this golden idol that's replaced her, and you're asked, or students were asked to talk about the effects of greed. Now with this question, as I say, literally any of the questions that you do in Christmas Carol to do with Dickens and Dickens's overarching message is to do with him showing the terrible effects of poverty and the terrible consequences of exploiting the poor in society. And of course, when you're thinking about the effects of greed, Scrooge's greed and his lust for money makes him a very isolated character within the novella, okay? And of course, he also loses the love of his life as a result of that. So of course, actually this question, you can interpret it almost as the opposite of the Fezziwig question, right? Whilst Scrooge becomes more consumed with greed and this robs him of his joy and happiness, you've got Fezziwig on the other hand, who is very generous and very giving, right? So you can also draw some really interesting contrast when you're thinking about the idea and the theme of greed to someone like Scrooge, whose joy and happiness is robbed, versus, in contrast, the ideal businessman like Fezziwig that Dickens is using to present to his rich readers, look, this is how you can be, because actually your generosity is only going to make you happier, okay?
Yeah, I like that you keep talking about contrast, which I find a really, really helpful way to get top marks. And one word for that is the antithesis. So when you look at Christmas Carol in particular, what's the antithesis? So who's the opposite, that means, of Scrooge? So as an employer, the opposite is Fezziwig. Who's the opposite of Scrooge as an individual? Well, it's Fred, who is really joyful, loves the parties that Scrooge rejects. And so once you start talking about contrast like that and the antithesis, really easy to write about Dickens' ideas and get the top grades. So it's prediction time.
Yes, so what do you think is going to come up this year?
So I have hoped that I've seen a pattern. So roughly every 3 years we get the poverty question. So it started with that, then we had it in, here we have 2020. It wasn't there in 2023, so I'm hoping 2024. And the other reason I'm going to predict it is, as I've hinted at all the way through here, every question's really about poverty. So if you prepare that one, you will be able to adapt it, even if the wording is completely different.
Okay, so my prediction is a little bit different. I'm going to go for a character question. More specifically, I think AQA is going to come up with yet another Scrooge character question, but more so taken, I'm going to make the very bold assumption that's going to be taken from Stave 1. Either when we first meet him, okay, so he's presented as solitary as an oyster and so on, or when he speaks to the charitymen. Both extracts would be taken from Act 1. And I personally think we're going to get a Scrooge question which either talks about how Dickens presents Scrooge as a character who changes, or just a generally broad question in the sense that how does Dickens present Scrooge's character as a greedy character or one of the other interesting themes. Okay, so I personally thought it's going to be a Scrooge question taken from Stave 1, and I say so as well because we haven't had that many Scrooge questions. In fact, when I'm thinking about the really specific character questions, they've only been about Scrooge. So I personally feel like the examiners will mainly focus on Scrooge's character if they give you an exam question based around characters.
Yes.
Yes.
I've noticed, as we've gone through and looked at patterns, that Stave 5 has never come up. And I've got a theory about that. I think you have to write about Stave 5 and the ending for every single question, because Dickens kind of ties everything up in a neat little bow, doesn't he? Lots of readers really hate how simplistic that feels. I really love the ending, but regardless of that, the ending gives you Dickens' ideas, and so that's why I think they'll never give you a question on Stave 5, because it kind of gives away the answer and says, well, if you write about the ending, you're going to get top marks, and they can't afford for everyone to get top marks. But luckily, if you've watched this video, you know to write about the ending, stay 5, in your conclusion to every question.
Awesome. Well, I hope you guys have found this prediction video useful, and make sure obviously you head over to FRTutors, where we have predicted what we think is going to come up in the upcoming Macbeth exams.
See you on Barbara's channel.